So, thank you all for being here tonight and welcome to the Arena series. We're thrilled to have you with us here tonight. This series, for those of you who are new, is a space where we talk about topics related to men that aren't often discussed. Our intention today and every day is to inspire people to trust themselves, to live authentically and vulnerably, and to step into the arena in every aspect of their lives. We were inspired to call this the Arena series from the work Brene Brown has done around vulnerability and Teddy Roosevelt's famous Man in the Arena speech. Our vision is for all of you to be people in the arena, daring greatly and striving valiantly forward like never before in the direction of what matters most to you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Coach Jake Fishbein. I'm one of the co-founders of the Arena series and an executive and personal coach who's trained with a former head of coaching at Google. I've worked with men for over half a decade, and I help men make and navigate their most important choices, both in the workplace and in their most meaningful relationships. I work with small business owners, mid-level executives, and run the Arena Men's Group alongside my Arena Series co-founder, Nick Papadopoulos. Nick and I are also finishing the final draft of a novel about a fictional men's group that we're super excited to be bringing to the world soon. Today, I'm joined by my good friend, Dr. Victoria Grinman, and we're going to be talking about men and fatherhood. Victoria is a therapist, speaker, and trainer to professionals and organizations all over the world. In her 17-plus-year career, she's supported people of all ages and backgrounds and been dubbed the parent whisperer for consistently generating relationship success between partners and parents with kids. Victoria, welcome to the Arena series, and I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you today.
Me too, Jake. I'm really excited to be here.
It's going to be a good one. Now, before we get started and dive into the conversation itself, there are a couple things we want to acknowledge that we believe are important before diving into this really deep and rich topic. The first is that until early this week, we didn't plan on having the conversation this way. We were supposed to be joined by Jim Hill, a good friend of mine and a fellow coach who I've been in men's groups with for almost 7 years. And Jim has done a lot of work around fatherhood in all the time that I've known him and even before that. Unfortunately, Jim chose not to be here tonight for personal reasons. And Victoria and I talked about canceling tonight's conversation. But we decided that the fatherly or parental thing to do was to roll with the unexpected and show up for the conversation anyway, to keep our word to all of you and have an engaging dialogue about men and fatherhood, which leads me to the second acknowledgement, which is that neither Victoria nor I are parents. And I'll admit for myself, even leading up to this conversation, before this shift, I felt a little awkward to be hosting a conversation about men and fatherhood, not being a father. And when Jim told me that he wasn't going to be here, I felt a little even more awkward. And at the same time, I've been thinking a lot over the last, I guess, month and a half or so, or 2 months, when Jim and I began talking about having this event about fatherhood and recognizing that I may not be a father, but I have done a lot of thinking and work around fatherhood, mostly through the vein of what it means to be a son. But I've also been working on a novel for almost 7 years that is so much about fathers and sons. And it's allowed me to explore my own father through that work. So I may not be a dad yet, but I know that I have a perspective to add to this. And, Victoria, I'm curious for you, what you think about us having this conversation, given that neither of us are parents.
Yeah, so I'm glad that we didn't cancel it because I think it's an incredibly important topic and conversation to have. But I was kind of excited. I feel like things don't happen. Things don't happen just to happen. They happen for a reason. And in many ways, I will never be a father. I hope to be a mom. And I've done so much work around fatherhood in my own experience as a daughter. And so working with parents often and understanding the experience of fatherhood from my perspective, I feel good about it. It'll just be a shift in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It something I was thinking about before this. I was doing some writing, as I always do before a conversation like this, is that everyone is a child. that everyone has that experience of being a child, even if everyone doesn't have the experience of being a parent. And by virtue of being a child, we all think about our parents. We all think about fatherhood and motherhood in different ways. We just may not be, I don't think I was conscious of the fact that I was thinking about it until I began thinking about having this conversation and recognizing, oh yeah, I have given this a lot of thought, which was kind of a startling realization to have in some ways.
Yeah. And I sometimes think about, well, what are the kinds of things that went on in my head about fatherhood throughout my life? And it's mostly how I wish my dad would show up, how I wish he didn't show up, how I wish it would have been like. And then as I've gotten older, really seeing him as a person outside of just some of the small things that I was really paying attention to as I was growing. So the perspective is really interesting. It's a good one to get into today. And I'm glad that we're here and doing it.
Me too.
Yeah.
So for all of you listening, both especially now, but those of you who are listening in the future too, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'd love to hear the questions or comments that come up for you as we talk about men and fatherhood over the next hour or so. And I know my intention today is for us to really dive into this topic in ways that maybe we haven't had this conversation before, to leave all of you thinking about who you want to be as fathers, whether you are a father already or not, but also who you want to be as men. I think actually everyone on this call right now is a man, which is really, really cool. And this conversation is so much about who you want to be as a man. So my hope for all of you as you walk out of here thinking differently about yourselves, about fatherhood, about your relationship with your own father, and who you want to be in the world today. What would you like to leave everyone with, Victoria?
Yeah, as we embark on this conversation, I'd really love for also everyone to think about what it's like to be a kid and what your experience of fatherhood has been from that perspective as well. So and I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm looking at some of the people that are here, and I know a couple of you from my own personal work with you, and I just think about how nobody comes to it knowing what they're doing. And when you think you know what you're doing, something else happens, whether it's a developmental stage or something else happens in your own life, and then all of a sudden you go back to the drawing board. And so just for me, always having this lens of compassion and just leaving everyone knowing that this isn't a place of critique so much as compassion and love, and for the whole experience of fatherhood.
Yeah, I always think about a story my dad said after I was born. I was him and my mom's first kid. That suddenly, I was there and he was both. He felt the most love in his life and the most absolute terror in his life and anxiety. And also like, what the hell do I do with this? There's no manual for what to do. And just that moment of not knowing. And from conversations with him, I know that moment of not knowing doesn't really go away. And that moment of love and terror doesn't really go away. It just evolves and changes as I've gotten older and as my brother have gotten older, different from those first moments, but ever present in that there is no manual for how to be a father. There is no right way for how to do it, or a wiki how, or fatherhood for dummies, although that may be out there. But it's not a user manual you can read, and it's going to give you all the answers for who your child needs you to be.
It's interesting and a great moment to share a distinction. You know how much we love distinctions. But the distinction, and I talk about this often, so if you know me, you've heard me talk about it, is the distinction between parenting as a dad or a mom, just parenting, and the actual parenthood or fatherhood experience is so different. And I think that so many of the people I work with, or even my own parents, sometimes focus so much on parenting, which is like the act of rearing your child. What do you do to make sure they have boundaries and they understand how to go through life in a way that is methodical and useful and socially acceptable, and all of that to be successful, right? And then like the experience of actually being a father and the experience of being a human that all of a sudden turns into a human that not only has to take care of themselves and continue to, or start to, because we know that so many people just start to at this point say, oh my gosh, I have to really look over here. And then also take care of another human. The experience of being a dad is very different than parenting a kid. And I think we pay attention to the rearing part so much of like, here's a tip, here's a strategy, and not so much, hey, what's this frightening experience like for you? Or what's this excitement like for you, you know?
And what have you seen in the men that you've worked with as you talk about that experience of fatherhood versus the fathering? Like what comes up for people as they begin to explore the experience versus the doing? I mean, we that other distinction of, we're not human doings, we're human beings. So being a father versus doing the rearing, as you've been talking about.
Yeah. The first thing that came to mind as you were sharing the question is the role of fatherhood and the role of dads and families. And this is by no means it is a generalization, but it's by no means a generalization to say that all families are like this. But I often find who calls me, it's usually the mom, if there is a mom. And and some dads do call, though the experience first is like not knowing what the role sometimes is, and where they fit in inside of the not only like day to day, but then also the part of like the development part. So lots of dads that I work with are experiencing it like they're just, they're kind of trailing along and being the support, but they're not the main parent.
Mhm.
And what I find after actually inviting fathers and giving them the space to come in, just like, any parent needs to come in and talk and to understand them, they actually have a huge role. And sometimes they're underutilized. And that I find interesting as well, and not really talked about. Just the importance of having a father and a family. So that's the first thing that's come up for me.
What it makes me think of is, I read this book, or I listened to it on audio earlier this year. Is called For the Love of Men by Liz Plank. And it was fascinating book. And one of the things she pointed out is that the way we talk about men as fathers, we have a really low bar for what great fatherhood is,
Mhm.
which is what you're saying is making me think about, which is these fathers being underutilized. She was saying, a father's a rock star dad if he's doing the bare minimum a woman normally does. And if a woman is doing the bare minimum acceptable for fathers, she's somehow a bad mother.
Mhm.
And this just acceptance of dads doing the bare minimum and that being excellent, which
Mhm.
is a little ridiculous, because there is so much of a man can bring to the table as a father, and to be, co-parents versus, one being the lead parent. But
Mhm.
I think about my own parents, and I am really lucky with who they are. They both brought such value in different ways to helping me and my brother become the people that we've become. And I wouldn't say one was more dominant than the other. They each had their lanes where they excelled and were able to bring that to the table in a way that I think for me, in my own experience, rounded me out in a different way, where I can see both of my parents within me, not one more than the other.
Mhm. I love that. And I'm wondering, what's something that you've gotten from your dad
Oh
that
my God.
you cherish? Just one
Oh,
thing, Jake.
it's just one thing. I'll be here for the rest of the night. Um, hmm, trying to think of just one thing. Um,
Okay, give us a couple of things.
okay, okay. I mean, my dad is, and I will probably get emotional as I talk about this. You know, one of the things I learned from my dad is the importance of making a difference for people. He's someone, he would never claim this because he's too humble, but he's someone who's made a difference for thousands of people.
Mm,
That he's, for the last 30 plus years, worked with coffee farmers in Central America to help them improve the quality of their lives. And I heard this story years ago from a friend of his, and his friend said, you know, your dad will deny this. He said that one time he was in Mexico going from town to town, that there was a boy running from town to town saying, Senor Bill is coming. My dad's name is Bill. Senor Bill is coming. And that every town, everyone would come out and thank him for what he'd done for them. And so I grew up watching my dad travel to Central America several times a year, always bring me back a t-shirt with a different country on it, with such a commitment to helping the people who ultimately helped him, because he had had a bunch of failed businesses, and it was the coffee industry and a cafe that helped him reach the American dream. And what did he do? He recognized that he wouldn't be there without those people. He went right back and he helped them.
mhm,
And I think as a kid, to get that message from my father, the importance of helping others. And by the way, most of the people he helped were women.
mhm,
It's just such a bar that I've, you know, held in my life for, you know, not always been helpful for me, especially
mhm,
when I was younger, but that bar of I've got to do something really valuable with my life.
mhm,
Not only I don't have to, I want to.
mhm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And he's certainly leaving a legacy.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm,
Absolutely. And I think oftentimes the work I do is it's not the same, but
mhm,
it's related. It's this ultimately his work is about human development and empowering people. And the
mhm,
work I do is about empowerment and giving power to men in a different way.
mhm,
Real agency and choice and power versus, you know, I think what we see as power in our world, which I don't think is power at all.
mhm.
And so it feels good to see that connection and be able to talk about things and recognize that we do different things, but there is this overlap. And I don't think I would be doing what I am without who he was for me, who he has
Mhm.
been for me. I mean, it's continuing. I'm lucky in that way.
I love that. And your story about your dad actually brings up a lot for me around what it means to have a parent, namely a father, that is leading themselves. And we call it self-leadership, or I call it self-leadership in the work that I do. Like, what does it look like to lead yourself in life in such a way where your actions, the way that you speak, the way that you leave people feeling when you're in their presence, um, actually creates this model, right? Like we call it role modeling, but it's really self-leadership. Like, who are you being such that when your children are experiencing you out there in the world, right? And then they're experiencing other people experiencing you, and they're kind of like, looking at that. How do you leave your child feeling about, what it means to just be a person in the world and carrying yourself a certain way? I think that's one of the most powerful things, right? That you can do for your child, speaking as a daughter, is to be the kind of person who leads themselves in a responsible way, such that it's intentional and you're really doing a justice doing that. And I think that's the experience of parenthood or fatherhood that I wish that we would focus on more. Not so much, oh my gosh, am I being perfect? Because I think a lot of the times, Jake, one of the things that consumes parents is what do other people think about me as a parent? And oh my gosh, my child is suffering because of their behavior or whatever. So that means I'm a bad parent. And so there's all this consuming thought about, am I a good parent? What are people going to think about me? Versus what if we had conversations around what does it feel like to be a person who is guiding another, and kind of out there in the world? What does it just feel like to be you, right? And who do you want to be? Because there's this feeling like you become a parent and then all of a sudden everything about you stops and everything's about the kid. And I have this program I'm running and it's in the beta phase. And it's interesting because when I'm coaching the program participants, they have such a hard time thinking about themselves as parents or as fathers. But when you start talking about their child, they have such an easy time talking about their kids. So there's so much less focus on them. And I don't know, not that I don't know why that is, but I wish that we brought it back to the focus on you.
What stands out to me, and I want to ask you the same question you asked me, but what I hear, and it's something that in our men's group we talk about a lot. Nick and I run a men's group called the Arena Men's Group, which many of you listening are in. That how you show up as a father, as a parent, your kids are picking up on, and that your kids are learning more from how you show up than the things you may actually be doing. And what I hear and what you're saying is when a father or mother, for that matter, isn't self-leading, isn't coming from that place of I matter too, but I've got to just take care of my kids. The message that's passed along is that's what it means to be an adult. Mm-hmm. And the kids are actually picking up on the way to live is not to self-lead. The way to live is you take care of other people, or mm-hmm. I'll become a parent and I'll lose everything about me to become a parent. And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about what we're communicating through our behaviors and our beliefs about ourselves that our people, especially our children, if we have children, are picking up on, because they are picking up on all of it, even if we're not saying it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I loved what you just shared. And the focus on, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but the focus on self is so important, and it's not selfish. Mm-hmm. In fact, when we start to lose, and this is coming from two kids, right? Like we're adult children, so we have every right to say how we feel. And how I feel is that parents need to focus more on themselves and making themselves happy and living out their goals in life, because that really is self-leadership. And that's what children are looking at most.
I'll say this. A few years ago, for my dad's 70th birthday, he decided he wanted to put on a cabaret show. His whole family's musical, and he always struggled with instruments. And then he discovered singing in his 60s. And so he spent like a year and a half preparing for this show, singing all these Sinatra tunes. And he asked me to sing something and my brother to sing something. And it moved me so much to see him so taking care of himself and expressing this thing that mattered so much to him, to celebrate him, because it wasn't about anyone else. And my brother and I were grown up. He had this opportunity to do exactly what you're talking about, which is indulge himself in a really meaningful way. And I mean, for him, singing became therapy. Mm-hmm. So it was this opportunity. Every song was diving into a different relationship. It was a really healing process as well as a celebratory process, which I think as a son, it was just like, yes, like this is beautiful. I have the playlist of the songs he sang because it reminds me of that, mm-hmm. and how important it is to honor oneself, regardless of what else is going on in your life.
Mm-hmm. Jake, didn't you sing a song during karaoke night at camp?
I did. I sang the song that I sang at his birthday. Karaoke Beautiful. Night, it was not as good.
We thought it was amazing. It was awesome. It was the best rendition of that song that I've ever heard.
Well, have you heard any other renditions of that song?
No, but we don't need to talk about that. It was wonderful. We were all in awe.
Well, I
That's
appreciate that.
great. I think that's awesome, right? Because it really teaches you to step outside of yourself and step into yourself, who you really are, not who you're supposed to be throughout the day, and really take on things that matter. So I think that's great.
Yeah. What about you? What are some of the most powerful lessons you've learned from your father?
It's a really, really big question.
Tell me about it.
Well, because it's changed so much over time and it feels so personal and so this is so unrehearsed, because normally being a therapist, I don't really talk about my life as much. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I share things with clients because I feel like if I have the opportunity to share something that will create, a shift or elicit something that works, then, it's okay. But my dad, I've shared with you, my dad and I have had, my mom and I are super close. And I would say that my dad and I are close in a different way. We've had a very interesting relationship where he brought out the rebellion in me, if you can see that. And I think for a lot of my life, Jake, I had issues with getting along with my dad because, as an adult looking back, I think I was a kid who had a lot of emotions. I was a little girl who, was very curious and emotional, and, how little girls are. And I think my dad is a very emotional person who has a very complex, rich, and interesting history with his own, set of personality traits and character traits and wishes and desires. And I think that when I was a kid, the experience with him was the experience you have. Like, have you ever sat on a school bus, like from camp? I'm Jewish, so camp has been like a thing my whole life, but like sitting on a camp and like maybe there are 3 people sharing the seat, and like your butt cheeks can't like fit completely on the seat. So like you're half off and you're feeling like you're fighting for that like butt cheek to kind of be on the seat. And there's just not enough room for the 2 of you or the 3 of you. So as a kid, I was like, it's all about me, right? So I wanted things to be about me because I was a kid. And I think it didn't feel like that. And it felt like my dad really wanted some space, more space than I wanted him to have. And I think because of that, my viewpoint about my relationship with my dad is I would roll my eyes and I would say, ugh, and I still do sometimes, like, ugh, like it's a thing, right? And looking at it now, I mean, for everything I blamed him for, I also blame him for the good. I mean, I'm here doing what I do, and I have an intuition for what I do because of him. And it's not because it was so contentious, but because who he is continues to have me get that parents are people too. And no matter how you slice it, and no matter what responsibility you think they are supposed to have to like make you happy and successful and do everything for you, my experience with him has me get people in a way that I never would have been able to get them had he not been my dad. In addition to the fact that he's extremely creative, extremely generous. I mean, you have to really fight when you walk into his house not to say, oh, I like that vase, because he'll be like, here, you know what I mean? Take it. He's just a beautiful human being to know and to be friends with. And I think just the complexity of our relationship has created this beautiful experience I have of my life. Now, talk to me in a month, Jake. I probably will be like, oh, my dad. And, but when you look at it a little bit afar, right, and kind of like gain the whole full frame perspective, I just owe him so much.
There's so much beauty in what you just shared. Everything from parents or people to being able to zoom out and see how much you owe your father for what he taught you, and the contentiousness and not being as a kid to have, be the focal point for everything, and gleaming the golden nuggets inside of that, being able to reflect on it and see how your relationship with your dad has given you this insight and this intuition to bring to your work. Just like what an enormous gift he's given you. And it's so beautiful to hear that. And for you to acknowledge, like, in a month, you may be in not zoomed out, and that's okay too. That's part of the wholeness of the experience.
Yeah. I think what's beautiful about, well, what I know of you, and I think I share in this as well, is we do a lot of deep work, and what about our, with ourselves. And I think that some of the impasses that I've had in my work with people over the years, especially with parents, have been in the same areas that there are impasses in my own life with my dad. And so I can't go deep with someone where I haven't gone myself. And so it's pushed me to understand people and dads in ways that I think otherwise I never would have been able to. And so it's a beautiful thing where I grow there and I also grow in my work. And it's a really nice compliment.
Yeah, no, I really connect with that. In the book that Nick and I have been writing for many years, more than we thought we would be, we're close to the end, that every draft I've written has been an opportunity for me to dive into a different relationship or relationships. And so much of the first draft was about my relationship with my father, and seeing him in a different way, and grappling with being an adult and taking responsibility and navigating just our relationship in a new way. And it definitely led me to have so much more compassion. And not that I didn't before, but in a different way, and to look at the world through his eyes instead of just my own. And I can't remember what we talked about, but after he read the draft, he called me, and it's changed over the years, so it's different. But the ending was so much about he and I, or him very specifically, and I mean, we're just both in tears. I think him feeling so seen and understood by his son, without me fully intending that, but using this medium to explore fatherhood and what it's like for a father to watch his son struggle, as I was at that point in my life, and my dad watching me. And he told me something which I put in the book, that his father told him, which my great grandfather told my grandfather. So who knows how far this goes back. But he said that when I was born, my grandfather took him aside. He said, father's role is not to point out when there is a pothole or a hole in the road in front of your child. It's to be there on the other side to help them stand up afterwards. And that really has stayed with me, I think, in the work that I do with my clients to allow them to fail, but also in watching my dad clearly both do that and struggle to do that with me and my brother, but always being on the other side. Even when he tried to point out the potholes, he's always on the other side with a hand held out to lift us towards where we want to go. And that is an immeasurable gift, to have that trust from a parent,
Mhm.
and him to have the willingness to let us struggle and not berate us for it or try to always correct us, but to see the value in our learning in the struggle and still being there afterward and during as a support system.
Mhm. That's beautiful. That's beautiful, Jake. And I'm listening and I'm thinking, as he's raring you, right? Like, don't do this, or I know the most probable outcome, right? Like I've
Right.
been there. And I think as we get older, also I find myself like saying those things and thinking, oh my gosh, it's just life experience, I guess, right? But then also his ability to have the foresight or the hindsight, I'm not sure, but one of those or both, to then also be there, right? For when it doesn't always work out, and to know the things to say and know the things to do to allow you to actually have that be a teachable rather than a mortifying or shameful moment. And I think it's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous thing that he's given you, because I think with so many of the things I hear from dads and moms, but I hear a lot of this too from dads, um, just this fear, right? The fear that can get in the way of like, I don't want my kid to go through that. And how do I prevent that? And to be able to say, okay, like this is par for the course. This is about, and so how do we then pivot? How do we help them, learn something from this and be their best self, um, and be with your own experience of that, right? Like it's not just about the experience your kid's having, but what is it like for you to experience your child going through heartbreak or some sort of failure, and then helping them get to that next place. I don't know why this comes up, maybe because I was a very social college age girl. But I remember a breakup in college. And like I said, my dad and I would go through things, but I remember my dad was always the one that I could like, dad, and he'd be like, what? What's
Mm.
going on? And anything I needed, even now, like he will drop it. And I remember staying at his home from college. I came back from the dorms and just stayed at his house the whole weekend and just sobbed. And he just did what I needed him to do. He was just being there with me. There was no teachable. I mean, the I told you so came later. Okay. I'm not going to give him all that credit. I'm going to be real here. The I told you so's always come from him. I wish they didn't, but they do. But in those moments, Jake, just the ability for him to just be with me and put himself aside for a moment and hold his tongue and just kind of be with me with what I needed is really what we want, from our dads.
That is so beautiful. And I think you're so lucky that he has that capacity,
Mm,
because I know from working with men that many men, many fathers don't have that. And I shouldn't say they don't have that capacity, but the automatic is not to just be with their child, or in your case, as you're going through this breakup, to just be with you, but to go into the fixing it and trying to soothe. And what a beautiful thing for him to just hold that space.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And yes, it is an acknowledgement for me that he does have that capacity. And it's not 100% all the time, but honestly, like when is anything 100% all the
Yeah. I mean, I think this is, you've been making this point throughout, which is, I'll say it again because I love it. I think it should be on a t-shirt. Parents are people too, that
I'm trademarking that, by the way. So anyone that, yeah, parents are people too. They
parents are,
are.
they are, that I know you've done several transformational workshops and I have too. And in every one, there's often a mother father exercise. And so often the takeaways I see from that are, wow, like my mom, my dad, they were doing the best that they could with what they had,
Mhm.
that they were doing the absolute best, and they're imperfect, and they didn't know. I I was thinking about this before too, that, and I think it might be one of the reasons me or other men, I don't know if other men have done this, but there's not a lot of, I'm 31, and there's not a lot of thinking about, okay, how do I want to be as a father? Although I think in writing this novel, I've thought about it more than most people, just in a different lens. But I know as a man, ever since I was a teenager, there's been this feeling of, I should just know how to do things. Like I should know how to change a tire. I should know how to have sex. I should know how to do my taxes or whatever. Just
Mhm.
innately as a man, I'm supposed to know it. By the way, without ever having done it before. But I should know it and I should be awesome at it.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And I imagine that it's the same with fatherhood. This
Mhm.
idea of, well, I'll figure it out when I'm a dad. Like I'll have a kid and suddenly like I'll just know.
Mhm.
And this recognition that that's probably not the way that it works.
Mhm.
And to acknowledge I don't know, just like all of those other things I didn't know. And some of them I still don't know. I don't know how to do my taxes. I'm lucky to have someone who helps me with them.
Mhm.
But to recognize that all of our parents didn't know, and they did the best that they could with the knowing that they had.
Mhm.
And I know for me that even when I become a father, I'll be asking for a lot of help from, luckily I'm in a men's group. I have help, and, I'll ask my own dad, because
Mhm.
I don't want to have that shame of I'm a man, I should know. So I'm not going to ask, because I would be a much better father for asking than for thinking I should just know it because, hey, I'm a man.
Mhm. I love that, Jake. Some of the most humbling moments I have in my work is when I have dads in my office, and we're having conversations and they're just so open to the feedback. And I see Dave saying in the comments, some things come naturally, others, friends and family and even strangers step in. And yes, right. I think about my dad. I'm 37. So I think about when, my gosh, I don't even know. I we were refugee immigrants, so we were very patriotic from where we came from, and then coming here and thinking about all of the things that were going on in my parents' lives and my father's at the time, being established in his career and being very patriotic, and it not necessarily being his decision necessarily or his choosing at first to come to this country. And then he was the one that cared for my brother and I while learning the language and doing all these things, and thinking about how he really didn't know how to juggle all of it and how emotional all of that was. Um, So, yes, stepping back and just recognizing that you're a person and our parents are people too. I just think it's so important because our relationships with our parents really do guide our own relationships with our kids one day. Um, and so many times, Jake, I just see parents often saying, I'm not doing this because my mother did that. And I don't want to be like my mother, or I'm going to do exactly what my mother did or what my father did because that was the right way. And that can be a panacea to something not so great. If we're just able to see that they just did what they did and they made the choices they made, and they made mistakes, and they also, right. And having some compassion and comfort in being gentle with them and yourself. Um, that's why I think it's so important that we talk about the fact that they're just people.
Yeah, they're just people. Parents are people too. Uh,
I love, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things that's come up is um, roles of dads and also masculinity, and
Mm,
what you think about that. Because there's just so much of who you're supposed to be as a man, and then how does that translate into father? And you work with men all the time, so I'm wondering, what do you see?
Yeah, well, such a great question, Victoria. And it's so interesting because I think in the work that I do, it's like masculinity is kind of the air that we breathe. We don't always talk about it. That it doesn't, it's not like we're in men's group and something like that's super masculine and that's masculinity. And, but I've given it some thought, especially when I listened to For the Love of Men by Liz Plank, which I referenced earlier, because she talked so much about how it's the norms around masculinity that are problematic, that are values of masculinity, not masculinity itself. And I listened to this great podcast that my therapist recommended a couple years ago or a year ago about testosterone. And I'm not an expert on this, so I don't remember the guy's name, but he's a leading expert, PhD in hormonal studies, and I don't even know if that's a thing. So again, this is a real interview that's done a lot of studies that what testosterone does is it makes us more of what we already are. And it encourages competition. And so, and I'll bring this back to fatherhood eventually, that in a society that says that what's masculine is violent and power and yelling and stoicism, that when a man feels his status challenged and he gets a boost of testosterone, the way to reassert his status is to express violence, power, yelling, and stoicism. Now, of our society said, no, being masculine or being powerful means being empathetic. It means listening. It means being having radical candor. Then when a man's status is challenged, he'd be more empathetic and he'd be a better listener and he'd be more radically candid. And so it's these values we place on masculinity that get in the way of a person's self-expression. Mm-hmm. I think with fatherhood, one of the big things is the role of being a provider and being a provider for children, for a partner. And a lot of men I've worked with, when they're not the provider in the family financially, they feel a lot of shame. And it gets in the way of them being parents. It gets in the way of them being intimate with their partners. It gets in the way of them feeling good about who they are because they're not making more money than their spouse. The way I think about it is there is something about men. If we go back thousands of years, I mean, there are reasons why we have stereotypes. They come from somewhere. And biologically, men, in the caves probably had to go hunt the elk and be the provider. And we've equated that with financial earnings right now. I think that a man can be a provider in so many different ways. We don't have to strip that from masculinity. We get to strip what it means to be a provider. So be a provider emotionally, be a provider with laughter and joy. And that's the opportunity I see for men and masculinity, especially in fatherhood, is to let go of the stories that our society says about what a father is. Mm-hmm. We got deadbeat dads and dads who run off and dads who cheat and dads who only play catch with their kids and never talk to them, and dads who don't talk about sex with their sons. And watch any old movie and you're going to see a version of fatherhood that has just been said that this is what masculine fatherhood looks like. And the fathers that I know aren't like that, especially the good fathers that I know. Mm-hmm. I think a fatherhood is there's no prescription that every father needs to find his own way of self-expression within fatherhood. Mm-hmm. What does it mean for me to be a provider? What does it mean for me to be a dad? What does it mean for me to support my kids? Mm-hmm. What does it mean for me to be a partner? Mm-hmm. And I'm really focusing on what does it mean to be, not to do, because that's what people are left with at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And you can be a provider and not earn a cent. Mm-hmm. And people can have the experience of being provided for and taken care of. And that's, I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's what I see. I see a lot of men getting caught up in the doing of the parenting, as you so aptly pointed out at the beginning, versus what's the experience that you're creating for your children? What's the experience you're creating for your family? I think that that's what people will remember, is the experience they had, not whether you know, did the dishes or read them books. I mean, they'll remember that too, because that's the expression, that's the demonstration of the being.
Yeah, this conversation is really is layered, and it's, for me, twofold. One, you're talking about a shift in the way that we see a father's role inside of a family. And I'm just thinking about so many of the men, and younger men actually, you know, around my generation, talking about how they're not the providers financially in their family, although, and they do all the other things, and how that's created, you know, a shift in their dynamic with their partners, and also in the family and in the community that they live in. So I'm hearing you talk about this really important thing, which is the way that we're thinking about fatherhood and the experience of being a dad by design. And so, what is that conversation of what that looks like, and giving yourself permission to do that? And then the other layer that I'm thinking about, and it speaks to Brene Brown, and I think I mentioned this to you in another conversation we had personally, which is when we look at shame. And, you know, I think I told you the anecdotal story, which came from one of her talks, where she was at a book signing, and a man came up to her and said, you know, thank you, you know, here's the 2 books for my daughters and my wife. And she signed them. And he said, you know, can I ask you a question? Why don't you study men? Why don't you write about men? And she goes, well, I don't study men and shame. And he goes, well, you should, because you know, I carry a lot of it, and it comes mostly from, you know, not feeling strong, or, you know, not being perceived as strong if you have emotions, or vulnerability is a big part of shame when, you know, when the conversation comes to men. So I think the other layer is when we start to actually unpack the shift of, this is what a father does inside of a family, this is how it's supposed to be. And then we're starting to actually open up the conversation around the shift to fatherhood by design, fatherhood by intentional design, fatherhood by design based on what your family's needs are and what you want to create with your partner or yourself if you're a single father. I imagine that it actually does open up many other vulnerable conversations around, well, what is it going to look like to bring that up to my partner? What does it look like to be the only one in my family, or the first one in my family, talking about fatherhood by design? Oh my gosh, what does it look like to actually go against my father who didn't do it that way? And so it brings up exactly the thing that we in our society don't always know how to talk about, which is all of the shame that is associated with actually even having this conversation and being in this conversation in the first place. So I think, like, before we have the conversation, we also have to set ourselves up powerfully to have it, and to say, it is going to come, like, this is, yeah, it's a fun thing to like create fatherhood by design, but like, it's going to bring up some things, and that's okay, because that's real. And we're not talking about something small here. We're talking about a shift. So of course it's going to kind of turn us on our side a little bit. So I think just the conversation around shame and the importance of, you know, talking about that as it relates to dads and allowing for it.
So, I mean, you gave me chills, Victoria, just as you were talking, because it's so, I mean, shame is living, it's everywhere. And everybody experiences shame in some capacity, whether it's big shame or small shame. And as you were speaking, what it made me think of, especially as you're talking about, you know, fatherhood by design, and maybe the first time doing it, is there is this thing where sons don't want to outshine their fathers, no matter how bad their dad may have been, even if he was absent. There is this thing of sons do not want to outshine their fathers. They don't want to be better than their dad. And it's fascinating. It makes me think of that, because so much of, you know, fatherhood by design, especially if you had a father who was, you know, say classic fatherhood, as our society kind of denotes it, or absent or just not there, that it can be scary to even be intentional, because it is becoming greater than your father.
Mm.
And there's something really scary about that. I know my dad has said to me for years, he says, I've already surpassed him, which is, as a son, a hard thing to hear. And I hear the beauty in it, in his acknowledgement, by saying that. And also I can always turn it around and thank him for giving me the gifts of getting me here. But it's hard to hear that as a son, especially when a father is still living. It's like, I'm not supposed to outshine my dad.
Well,
Not yet.
I guess I'm curious, what does that mean to you that you've outshined? So your dad is this, like, you've
I know.
placed them, on this, I don't want to say, but yeah, you've placed him on this very, very high level, and now you've outshined him. What is that? Is that scary? It's like, how does that feel?
I mean, for me, I relate to it. I guess I don't think I have. Not in terms of I haven't, but it's like we're two different people living different lives at different times. And I'm lucky enough to get to learn from him and to stand on his shoulders, to get to a different place in my life, given the gifts he gave me. I don't think that's outshining him. I don't think that's not outshining him. I think we both get to shine brightly in our own ways. And I can acknowledge his acknowledgement of me and his celebration of the man that I've become, without feeling better than or worse than or hiding from it, which I think I may have done in the past. And frankly, I'm just yeah, Dave, I see your comment. That, and I'm just putting these dots together now, of that allowance of, no, there really is, there's no competition. And not that I thought it was, but we both get to shine brightly, and an honoring of us two being two different humans, connected and sharing, but different.
Yeah. And giving him the gift of letting him have his experience as a father,
Yes.
regardless of what you feel about it, right? You can talk about that in therapy or with your friends, or like internally go, what does that even mean? And, but letting him, and by acknowledging him and what he's shared with you, letting him have that experience. And I think that's a gift that children, but adult kid, like people who really do the work, are able to have their experience, but also not take away an experience from someone. And that's part of parenting too, is being able to have your own experience and allow a kid to have theirs. So it's really a beautiful full circle, experience overall.
It is. I love you saying that, because I think that's where I've landed with it, is appreciating and acknowledging and allowing both of us to have our experiences, knowing they're different, given we're different phases of our lives. I have a lot ahead, and he's, doesn't have as many years left as I do, unless they invent some kind of drug that makes us immortal. And I mean, and that's even hard to acknowledge that, as I think, both my parents are living, and I've been thinking about a lot. My grandmother passed away last year, and to think about, both of their parents are gone, which is to contemplate the departure, the passing of a parent, is really hard. And it's something I don't like to think about very often, even though I can't escape that experience. None of us can.
No, unless it happens unnaturally. And I think in many ways, that acknowledgement of mortality, and I was driving today, and I had a very light day, which was beautiful. I worked, but I had some breaks in my day. And due to the acknowledgement of that life cycle and my age and my parents' life stages, I just picked up the phone, and I know this sounds very like, so what's the big deal, Victoria? But I haven't been, consistently in communication with my father the way that I am with other people in my life. I just picked up the phone and just unabashedly called him. And the way he picked up the phone was like, hello, like, what's coming? I said, how are you, Dad? And we just had this beautiful conversation. But what went away was ego. Ego was not, like, ego was there. She was there, but like, it wasn't part of, it was kind of like I was able to, in my life stage, say, I get those feelings from a very young place of wanting him to call and him to want to talk to me and him to, right? And I miss my dad and I want to know how he's doing. And God knows what will happen tomorrow. So might as well just call while I'm, in the car. And just the beauty of getting older and recognizing our parents as just people. I don't mean to keep plugging that in, but it's true, right?
Trademarked.
That like, yeah, that I thank goodness I was raised in such a way where I can take care of myself and parent myself in many ways, that I could just be with them like people.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I miss you. I want to talk to you, not I need something from you.
That is beautiful, Victoria. You saying, I get to reach out. I get to go first.
Yeah.
I hear so many people, men and women, clients I've worked with, friends even, saying, no, they're older. It's on them. It's like, I'm not going to clean it up. It's like, it's on my dad to clean it up. Like if there's an upset, and I get it. I get where that can come from. And I mean, it's like, well, are you really willing to wait for that?
It's a beautiful question, because that's been, going back to the two butt cheeks on a seat. I'm always like, you're the dad, like, let me have my, right? It's always been like, why do I always have to clean it up? But now realizing that it's really bigger than that. It turns you inside out a little bit, regardless of how great or, your relationship is with your parents. It really has you sort of step outside yourself and think about what's most important. And it leads me to this next question, which I'm sure would be a wonderful tie to this amazing conversation, which I would love to ask you first. Being that we're not parents, but we work with them, and being that we would like to become parents, and we have this interesting experience of fatherhood from our perspective, what would you like for fathers to be, to know, or to keep in mind as they're at the precipice of becoming a father?
I mean, a few things, but the first thing, which I've been thinking about often in this conversation, which Nick says often, is that your kids will be your greatest teacher. And I think that in particular, that, and to trust the process. And because fatherhood, I'm imagining, is a huge lesson in development and growth and learning. And it's hard, and there's no manual, and you're going to mess it up. To trust the process and to look for the learnings inside of it. And I think the big one is to be kind to yourself as a father. I know this from Nick, who is not in this call. Nick has 2 boys, and a few years ago he was sharing about, they were going through, one of them was going through a tough time. And Nick's Mr. Coach, like Mr. Transformation, he does everything. And he was so upset with himself for not being the best dad that he could be. And Nick's an amazing father. And for me, it was in the midst of writing the book, and just recognized that no matter how much work a person does, your kids are going to have their problems. That you can't save your kids from their own growth. And to be kind to yourself, to know that you're doing the best you can. And that if you did everything perfectly, your kids are still going to have their problems. Kids are still going to have their challenges. And that's okay. that's part of their learning and growth too, is just allow, you know, just to allow for the pain of living.
Mm-hmm.
So as a, for the fathers out there and the fathers to be, allow your kids to experience the pain of living, because without it, it's part of the fullness of life, and you will contribute to it. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
What would you say, Victoria? What would you want to offer to the fathers to be, or the fathers out there?
I agree with your trust the process. And so I'll add trust the struggle, trust your struggle, which really comes out of my own post-traumatic growth research and learning that growth comes from struggle. It doesn't always come from the pain, but it comes from the struggle of like dealing with, and what do I mean by struggle? It's like you're going to deal with stuff. And so trust that. And I think paying attention to yourself, again, going back to the beginning of this conversation, just the importance of not losing yourself inside of the parenting and all the things that people say, but to always come back to yourself and check in with how you're doing. Kids are like, I'm looking at my dog because she's gotten up and wants to eat, but kids are like puppies. They know and see everything. You're eating at night and they're like, one eye open. They see everything. They smell everything. They know when you're in distress. They know when something's up. They know when you're happy, and they know when things are okay. And you can't hide it. I think the more you try to hide it, that's where we start to see challenges with kids, where they think, oh, people are hiding stuff because it's not okay to feel it, or it's not okay to talk about it. So then they sit with their own things in privacy and a lot of, discomfort. And so if you could just acknowledge yourself and acknowledge where you're at, regardless of where you are in the process, and trust it, that's the best thing that you can do. Which sounds easier than it is, but that's what I would share.
Yeah. I want to add one thing to that. I think what you shared is perfect. Is the thing about my own dad is to cry in front of your kids, to allow your kids to see you cry, to see you hurt. I think especially as a son, that was one of the greatest lessons my dad gave me without even trying. He was just being himself. But in the moments where he was hurt and I got to see it, showed me that I could be hurt and show it too.
I love it.
Well, I think we're right at the end of our conversation, which has been wonderful and so far reaching. So thank you so much, Victoria, for joining for this. And for those people on the call who are listening now or listening in the future, when you have a program you're running, and two, how can people get in touch with you? I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're up to for our listeners who might be interested.
Sure. Well, if you want to work with me, you know how to reach me, but people can reach me at growingkindminds.com. And then what I do want to share is something I'm super, super proud of, which is, for a really long time, I was working with people one-on-one. I still am, though I noticed that many people either can't afford or can't get in touch with, because I can't clone myself yet. Some of the work that I do. And so placing it into a framework has been this year's work. It's been really fun. So I created a program called Permission Slip Parenting, which is really based on the premise of giving yourself a permission to just be real. And as a tip for everyone, I would love to share what the real method is. And it's kind of like a takeaway cheat sheet for yourself to know if you're creating a context that's real. Because as you and I both know, Jake, when you stand in a morass, you can't really do much if you're, thigh high. And am I allowed to curse here?
Yeah, curse all
okay, like when you're
you
like
want.
standing in shit, it's like putting like a cherry on a pile of poop, like it doesn't look great. But if you're actually able to be real and give yourself permission to just be and know what it is to be and start from a place of clarity, then anything can be possible inside of your relationships with yourself, with others, especially your kids as a dad. So the real method inside of permission slip parenting stands for always asking yourself 4 questions. One is, are you trying to be right, or are you trying to seek understanding? And what we want is to seek understanding. Being right keeps us stuck. E stands for, are you creating an empowering context, which is really about, are you giving choice to your child to choose? You know, a teachable moment isn't a demand. It's the ability to create choice as an option to learn. A stands for, are you attached or committed to something? And being attached, you know, to it being a certain way keeps us stuck. And L is, are you leading with love, which is really about self-leadership coming from a place of over here. And I always say, like, if your heart could talk, what would it do? What would it say? What does it need? So are you being real? And so that's what I do when I take parents through a process. You can look it up on permissionslipparenting.com. And that's been my baby before I become an actual mom at some point soon, hopefully, and something I'm really proud of and want to take people on a journey through.
That is so cool, Victoria. And for anyone wanting to work with Victoria, she is, as you could tell from listening to this conversation, absolutely awesome and so smart and so intuitive and can see so much. And what I'm hearing the real method for the first time is how powerful that would be in any relationship, not just as a parent, but to bring those 4 questions, especially to challenging conversations, and how it can lead to such depth and connection. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight. For those of you who also are interested, we do run a men's group. I run it with Coach Nick, called the Arena Men's Group. You can find us at www.thearenaseries.com. We do have space for new members if you're interested in joining. We meet every other week on Zoom for 2 hours. We have men spread across the country, everyone from 28 years old to 74 years old. So everyone is welcome, and it's a space to have conversations like this, to dive into what does it mean to be a man today, to be held accountable in seeking your vision of who you want to be, and to have a community of men supporting you in your growth and development. So
before
yes.
you close, I do want to say one last thing.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, I want to acknowledge you. First of all, thank you for inviting me into this world, and also introducing me to so many people that you work with that I just honestly fulfill my week when I work with them. So it's amazing. But I want to share something in front of others about you that I think is really important, especially as we talk about fatherhood and you talking about your desire to be a dad one day. When I first met you, we were at camp that Brian Helfman, who's on this call, actually created the experience of. And at the end, we were in our GPS groups, if you know.
Good Peep Squad, for those of you listening.
That's right. And one of the things that I acknowledged you for was, it was so beautiful. And I love my dad, and I really do have an incredible model of a man in him, despite and because of all of the things that we went through. And being there that weekend and having met you and had the conversations with you that we had and the time that we had, being in the presence of someone who, you're a young man and with such an old soul and so much to connect about, and you just provide so much for the people around you in just who you are and who you be. And I just see so much growth all the time. And it's incredible. And so thank you for who you are and for acknowledging everything that this experience is and just who you're being.
Well, thank you. It means a lot to hear it from you. So I appreciate it so much, and appreciate you and our friendship. And, you know, I've been thinking this whole conversation, I know we're over now, but I'll wrap up with this about how relationships and friendships evolve, you know, because we met at camp and then we didn't talk for a very long time because we were both really busy. And then suddenly here we are having this conversation. And I wouldn't have predicted this well, a year ago, I didn't know you, but I wouldn't have predicted this at the end of summer camp last year. And so to be here is just this amazing reminder of the path is the path. And I'm really grateful that you're on my path and that we got to share this experience, and look forward to other conversations like this that I'm sure we'll be having in front of more audiences at some point. So
thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you everyone who tuned in to join us tonight. Appreciate you spending your Thursday night with us, and we will see you next time on the Arena series. So take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.